At first, then, I become aware of the thing as a one, and have to hold fast to it in this its true character. If, in the course of perceiving it, something turns up which contradicts it, this is to be recognized as a reflection of mine. Now, there also occur in the perception various properties which seem to be properties of the thing. But the thing is a one, and we are conscious that this diversity by which it would cease to be a one falls in us. So in point of fact, the thing is white only to our eyes, also tart to our tongue, also cubical to our touch, and so on. We get the entire diversity of these aspects, not from the thing, but from ourselves. And they fall asunder in this way for us because the eye is quite distinct from the tongue, and so on. We are thus the universal medium in which such moments are kept apart and each exist on its own. Through the fact, then, that we regard the characteristic of being a universal medium as our reflection, we preserve the self-identity and truth of the thing, its being a one. In section 119, Hegel is going to make a very important transition. So far we've been talking about things on the side of the object primarily, and consciousness has been, you might say, sort of parasitical upon the object. Although consciousness, as we've seen happen before, is really where the main show is going on. It's just that consciousness loses sight of that sometimes and places what's really going on the side of the object. But Hegel is an idealist. So things are going to fall within the scope of consciousness. Here we're going to see an important transition take place, not in its full unfolding, that's going to happen in further paragraphs, but at least in its beginnings. So we want to look at this incipient movement and the principles on which it's based. And what do we see Hegel reminding us of? At the very beginning of this, it reads very much like the other sections. At first I become aware the thing is a one, I hold fast to it, and in this its true character. If in the course of perceiving it something turns up which contradicts it, that's to be recognized as a reflection of mind. So any sort of deception, any sort of, particularity, anything that's wrong is on my side. I bear responsibility for that, he said. The object is just what it is. Or is it? So he goes on and he says, there also occur in the perception various properties. Now notice at this point, he's saying, where do we actually perceive the properties? Do we perceive them in the one, in the object? We'll use this as an example because I'm tired of talking about chalk all the time. This blue cloth, which is soft, which has the property of ductibility or flexibility, has certain size, certain feel to it, it's kind of sound that maybe you can hear that rustling. Are those in the object, or are those in our perception of the object? This is a term that, by the way, is taken in much of modern philosophy. There was a distinction that was made between primary and secondary qualities that you see Locke making a lot of, but Locke isn't the first person to come up with this. The notion is that on the side of the object, there are some things that actually are properties residing in the object, but then there are some things that are only in our perception of it. So sweetness, for example. Is sweetness really something that's present there in the object as sweetness, or is that in how we perceive it? The sweetness of honey, for example. It's due to glucose, or maybe sucrose, or fructose, or I don't know which ose is in honey. I'm sure somebody will put it in the comments. But it doesn't matter. That's not an important point. The point is that there's a chemical there in the thing, but the chemical itself doesn't have a taste. It has a taste for us, for a subject, for a perceiver. So he says, there also occur in the perception various properties which seem to be properties of the thing. But the thing is a one, and we're conscious that this diversity, by which it would cease to be a one, falls in us. So all these properties, if we think of honey, for example, as gooey and, sticky and sweet in a certain way, and amber colored, although I know there's other kinds of honey that are different colors. You don't need to remind me of that. If we think about that, those those properties as determinate are not really residing in the thing he's saying, but rather in our perception of it. So the diversity, the plurality of properties resides somehow in consciousness. Now, how can that be? Well, what he's saying here makes good sense. Follow it through. He says, this diversity falls in us. So in point of fact, the thing is white only to our eyes, also tart to our tongue, also cubical to our touch. There are organs by which we are perceiving these things, right? And so on. We get the entire diversity of the aspects, not from the thing, but from ourselves, or rather, if he's speaking more properly, through our perception of the thing. We grasp those properties in perception by means of the organs through which we perceive, sense perception. And we put them all together then into something that's like an image or a picture of that thing that's out there that we're perceiving, or maybe in there if we're putting something into our mouths, right? So he says, they fall asunder in this way for us. Why? Because the eye is quite distinct from the tongue, and so on. So we, human beings, we perceivers, are the universal medium. You remember that we said that the thing was the universal medium before, but now Hegel is saying, no, actually the thing is a unity, it's a one, and the universal medium of these properties is really in us, in consciousness, in the fact that we perceive these things in multiple ways and then form them together into a new unity. We're the ones who see salt in a variety of different perspectives. We're the ones who see this blue thing in a variety of different perspectives by putting it up to our skin, by rustling it, by, I don't know, I suppose this would be a property, slowly falling or fluttering, All of those are things that we ourselves bring to it. We contribute that to it. They're, you might say, they're in the thing waiting to be liberated, but the thing itself will never liberate those properties from each other, precisely because it's a unity of them. So, if we go on and he says, through this fact that we regard the characteristic of being a universal medium as our reflection, that's what allows us to preserve the self-identity of the thing, it's being a one. So we are actually the ones who are making the thing be a thing, and we are the ones who, through our perception, through our capacities for that, and through the activity that we're engaged in as conscious beings, make these properties be what they are. But, regarded as existing each for itself in the universal medium, these diverse aspects for which consciousness accepts responsibility are specifically determined. White is white only in opposition to black, and so on. And the thing is a one precisely by being opposed to others. But it is not as a one that it excludes others from itself, for to be a one is the universal relating of self to self, and the fact that it is a one rather makes it like all the others. It is through its determinateness that the thing excludes others. Things are therefore in and for themselves determinate. They have properties by which they distinguish themselves from others. Since the property is the thing's own property, or a determinateness in the thing itself, the thing has a number of properties. For in the first place, the thing is what is true. That is, it possesses intrinsic being. And what is in it is there as the thing's essence, and not on account of other things. Secondly, therefore, the determinate properties do not only exist on account of other things and for other things, but in the thing itself. Yet they are determinate properties in it only because they are a plurality of reciprocally self-differentiating elements. And thirdly, since this is how they are in the thinghood, that is, in the essence of the one thing of which they are properties, they exist in and for themselves, indifferent to one another. It is in truth, then, that the thing itself that is white and also cubical, also tart, and so on. In other words, the thing is the also, or the universal medium, in which the many properties subsist apart from one another, without touching or canceling one another, and when so taken, the thing is perceived as what is true. In section 120, we may see something that looks a little bit like a, not lack of progress, but actually falling back into where we just were. In section 119, we saw we were making some progress by turning to consciousness, and now as we go through this, it's going to sound as if Hegel is saying just the same stuff as he said in the previous sections in perception, but in actuality that's not the case. It's part of a larger context in which he is slowly getting us ready to continue this transition into focusing on the side of the conscious subject. So he starts out by saying, regarded as existing each for itself in the universal medium, which we saw now is on the side of consciousness, these diverse aspects for which consciousness accepts responsibility are specifically determined. Now, what does that mean? That means that they are distinct from each other, and they're distinct in different ways. So he gives as an example, white is white in relation to its opposite, black, right? It's not white just in relation to its opposite, which is not a true opposite except in the thing, hardness or softness or chalkiness or tastiness or bitterness or anything like that. It's a color, and it's determined that way. Red is, in opposition to, I suppose, green, or in opposition to white, or in opposition to black, because it's not those things. But it's not those things in a different way that it's not the odor of roses. So, he goes on and he says, the thing is a one for consciousness precisely by being opposed to others. So each thing, each unity, is a one by not being the other thing. The chalk is not the book, is not the tie, is not the man, it's not the camera. And we can go on and on like that. This book is not the same book as you're reading because it's a different copy, right? This one has certain properties. Some of those properties are pretty similar to the one that you would be reading, but some of them would be different, such as being in Dr. Sadler's hand right now, which is a rather contingent property, but you get what I'm saying. So he says, it's not as a one that it excludes others from itself. To be a one is the universal relating of self to self. This is stuff that we've seen already. The fact that it's a one rather makes it all like the others. So we can talk about unity in general, right? Being a one, and we saw this movement with sense perception as well, right? With sense certainty. Pick any sort of individual object you like and say, individual object. Well, hell, every object's an individual object, so you haven't really said an awful lot by saying individual object. The more that we insist upon particularity, ironically, the more we launch ourselves into a kind of generality, and an empty generality as well, that is not going to contribute an awful lot here. So he says the fact that it's one makes it like the others. It's through its determinateness that the one excludes others. Now, how is the thing determinate? That is where we want to look at these properties. And Hegel is going to have a little play on words here, using the term eigen, one's own, right? Proper, you could say. And the word for property is Eigenschaft. So literally the condition or the substantiation of being eigen, being one's own, being particular, being specific. And the thing has these properties, and as we've seen, these properties are differentiated not only from white from black, things from their opposites, but also from each other. So the whiteness of the salt is not the same thing as the tartness of the salt, is not the same thing as the granularity of the salt. This is all kind of old refresher, right? But it's in having these properties as proper to itself. We have kind of that word here with the proper, specific to it. The Greek would be idion, the word that we get idiot from, by the way. There's a different thing going on there. So he says, things are, therefore, in and for themselves determinate. They have properties by which they distinguish themselves from others. Since the property is the thing's own property, or determinateness in the thing itself, the thing has a number of properties. You don't have a thing without having properties. You would just have an empty nothing. You would have something that you couldn't hang anything upon, you couldn't point at it, you couldn't mean it, intending it, you couldn't talk about it in language, you couldn't think it. So he goes on and he says, in the first place, the thing is what is true. He's giving you these three different conditions that he's going to talk about for what's going on here. In the first place, the thing is what is true. It possesses intrinsic being. And what is in it is there as the thing's essence and not on account of other things. That's one perspective that you can take on this. So the property that this thing has, in the case of the chalk, the whiteness of the chalk is there for the chalk as part of what that chalk is. It is of the essence of the chalk. It makes that thing what it is. It contributes to the unity of that thing being that thing. The same would go for any of the other things that this thing is being differentiated from in consciousness and in reality. He says, secondly, therefore, the determinate properties do not only exist on account of other things and for other things, but in the thing themselves. But they're determinate properties in it only because they're, as we've seen, that's why I've got these arrows here, a plurality of reciprocally self-differentiating elements. Now, what does that mean? A little bit of a refresher. This property is different and distinct from this property, is different and distinct from this property, which is in turn different and distinct from this property. They are not what the other is. They are determinate by not being what the other is. I use the metaphor sort of pushing off of each other, which is probably the most tangible way that we can think about it. And they push off of each other without at the same time like turning the chalk into nothingness. If they were able to overcome that tension entirely and shoot away from each other, we would be left with no thing, no unity that we could talk about. But it's because that tension exists within the thing that we are able to perceive it as a thing and as having properties. He says, thirdly, since this is how they are in the thinghood, in the essence of the one thing of which they are properties, they exist in and for themselves, indifferent to one another. Each one of them is like a little world unto itself, the whiteness of the chalk, existing in itself, that is, being what it is, but also existing for itself. You might say, although Hegel's not going to go into this, that the white is doing whiteness, and that's all it really knows or cares about, if we're being a little bit metaphorical here. And the cubicality just does, its cube thing and doesn't care about what the white thing is doing. It's indifferent to it. It's also indifferent to whether we're perceiving that or not. So he goes on and he says, they exist in and for themselves, indifferent to one another. It's in truth, then, that the thing itself is white and also cubical and tart and so forth. In other words, the thing, once again, becomes not only a unity, but also the universal medium in which the many properties subsist apart from one another without touching or canceling one another. When so taken, the thing is perceived as what is true. But notice that all of this is happening where? In consciousness, which is carrying out the act of perception. Now, in perceiving in this way, consciousness is at the same time aware that it is also reflected into itself, and that in perceiving, the opposite moment to the also turns up. But this moment is the unity of the thing with itself, a unity which excludes difference from itself. Accordingly, it is this unity which consciousness has to take upon itself, for the thing itself is the subsistence of the many diverse and independent properties. Thus we say of the thing, it is white, also cubical, and also tart, and so on. But insofar as it is white, it is not cubical, and insofar as it is cubical and also white, it is not tart, and so on. Positing these properties as a oneness is the work of consciousness alone, which therefore has to prevent them from collapsing into oneness in the thing. To this end, it brings the insofar in this way, preserving the properties as mutually external, and the thing as the also. Quite rightly, consciousness makes itself responsible for the oneness, at first in such a way that what was called a property is represented as free matter. The thing is in this way raised to the level of a genuine also, since it becomes a collection of matters, and instead of being a one, becomes merely an enclosing surface. In section 121, we're now going to see this active role of consciousness coming to the fore. Hegel will tell us that in perceiving this way, consciousness is aware that it's also reflected into itself. Okay, so that's something that we've heard many times before. That's not radically new. But what does that mean? In perceiving, the opposite moment to the also turns up. What was the also? The also was the thing, insofar as it was a bunch of properties that existed in a kind of miasma or soup in which they, didn't really interfere with each other or connect up with each other. So he says, in perceiving the opposite moment to the also it turns up. What is that opposite moment? He says this moment is the unity of the thing with itself. Okay, we've also heard that come up before. That's this movement by which the thing is sort of like everything else in the Hegelian universe, becoming other to itself, and thereby introducing these tensions. It's, a lot of really cool stuff goes on. But again, is something new going on here, we want to ask. So he says, this movement is the unity of the thing with itself, a unity which excludes difference from itself. So other things are different, it's excluding them. Accordingly, it's this unity which consciousness has to take upon itself. The thing itself is the subsistence of many diverse and independent properties. So how does consciousness actually do this? This is where we're going to see some really important active contributions on the part of consciousness. A lot of people want to, think about Hegel in terms of Kant. This is one of the areas where Kant would actually be kind of useful to think about, in part because Kant was saying, and he's not the only person saying this, of course, but he's one of the people saying this, that our minds are really active, that the order, that the structure that we perceive in things out there isn't necessarily in those things. It's something that we are imposing upon them through the faculty of the understanding by which we're taking them in, even with sensibility to a certain extent. But the understanding plays a really important role. Hegel's not going to worry at this point about differentiating these things. He's going to talk in terms of consciousness. But he says, the thing itself is these diverse and independent properties. So we say of the thing, it is white, right? It has this property of whiteness. It is cubical, and also tart, and so on. Now he's going to use this term insofar, which if we want to, be kind of cutesy with playing on words, we could say, fern also means far. Distancing is going on here. I suppose there's something that could be said about that, but we don't really need that at this point. But it's kind of an interesting point to dwell on. He says, insofar as it's white, it's not cubical. So we've already seen, these properties differentiate from each other. How do they hold together then in some sort of unity? That's the key question that we've been dealing with. And we see that there's this tension. Insofar as the thing is a unity, these properties have to be all sort of congealed together. Insofar as they can be properties, the thing can't really be as unified as it would like. It has to be more like a universal medium in which these properties are free to be themselves. And, where is the truth? It's somewhere in between. It's been fluctuating back and forth, hasn't it? We want to try to hold on to both ends of the truth at the same time, which is always difficult to do. So he says, positing these properties as a oneness is a work of consciousness alone. Not of the thing. The thing doesn't posit these. The thing doesn't think these. The thing could bring them into unity, but the thing is actually rather passive. It's consciousness that is positing the thing as a unity. It's giving unity to the thing. Literally in German, the word for this is in einsetzen. It is taking the properties and putting them into one, in eins, in a unity. So I've got this, depicted here. Of course, there's a limit to what we can do with modeling, right? But each property is taken up into the thing by this positing on the part of consciousness. Each property is taken up as being what the thing is, as being connected with the other properties, as being part of a unity, a way in which the thing is related to itself. The thing isn't doing that on its own. It is consciousness which is doing that with the thing and its properties. That's an achievement to realize that at this point. The activity of consciousness. Hegel goes on. That's not where the activity ends. He says, to this end, it brings in the insofar. And where does this insofar come in? The insofar is at the level of the properties. And this insofar is what differentiates these properties from each other, right? It puts the bar between this property and this property, and these two between each other, right? I know it's getting a little bit messy here, but you get the idea. The insofar says, insofar as this property is what it is not that. Consciousness is contributing both of these at the same time. Unity and difference. How can that be the case? How can something be contributing something and its opposite at the same time? Well, that's where we get to see the Hegelian system at work, isn't it? A thing calls for its very opposite. And what's able to do that? Not things by themselves. Consciousness. In a way, this is like going back to Aristotle's dictum that the soul is in a certain way all things. That it's capable of having, a thing and its opposite at the same time. Whereas things can't really do that on their own. So he's going to go on and he says, quite rightly, consciousness makes itself responsible. Again, we see this word responsibility coming up, at first in such a way that what was called a property is represented as free matter, material, something that actually can have an agency of its own. The thing is, he says, in this way raised to the level of a genuine also, since it becomes a collection of matters and instead of being a one, becomes merely an enclosing surface. So we see once again, we juggle between these two viewpoints of the unity of the thing or the also of the thing. If we want to focus primarily on the thing, then we have to see it as a unity, and then the properties are kind of subservient to it. And then we have the side of this positing going on. If we want to see these properties for what they are, then we have to view the thing as an also, as this indifferent medium that mirrors the indifferent medium over here. And then we have a focus on difference instead. And all of this is taking place because of the agency of consciousness that we've now uncovered.